And we are live for episode 18, I think. We'll get it
That's
this year.
right.
Um, and a pleasure and a privilege to have my good old friend Peter Brooks back to chat with us. Peter has got the ability to challenge people um, and sometimes challenge them more than what they wanted to be challenged. uh, Pete, welcome back.
Yeah, good to
Good.
be here. Yeah, good to be chatting, and good to know things are going well with you. And congratulations on getting to talk 18 in just 1 year. That's quite um, a, a big contribution you've got there to interesting discussions.
Yeah, I must admit, I really enjoy the conversations. I learn a lot out of it, and I hope that the audience also learns a lot out of it. And what I tend to find is that our live viewers are not that many,
Mm.
um, but a lot of people go back and either watch it on, Facebook or LinkedIn or YouTube. Um, so we get quite a over time quite a good response. So thank you for your willingness to make a contribution. Um, and hopefully give some insights to people who's going to listen to the conversation. Number one, and yeah, as I say, I quite like the fact that you challenge people. So Peter, I think we've known each other now for most probably 15, 20 years.
At
Um,
least, yes.
yeah,
I think longer than that, because I moved to South Africa last in 1999. So I was
okay,
involved with the ITSMS essay from about then, I think. So
yeah,
it's a bit over 20 years.
sure. How time flies.
It does.
It is scary. And now you're back in the UK, um, going into winter.
Yes, with an
Uh,
interesting question about whether gas will be affordable to keep us warm. No,
yeah,
it's
well,
exciting times, unfortunately.
I think it's the world over. It's exciting times, and
Mm.
most probably one of the reasons why organizations making sure that they do the right things for the right reasons are so important. And that brings us to our conversation about governance. You know what? And I think most people, when they hear the word governance, they tend to think of a bunch of rules that stop them from doing anything.
Absolutely.
Um, and the reason for that is most probably because most people in governance roles have got a very heavy-handed approach. It's this approach that if I if I tell people they can't do anything, so that means I've got lots of controls in place, then nothing can go wrong. But that in itself is a risk. Um,
Major delusion. Yeah.
yeah. So, who can you remember who that academic was that wrote the book From Control to Drift?
Doesn't ring any bells.
Um,
But I think it's unfortunate to go that far. Um, and it's quite a good metaphor, really, with that wonder of sailing or navigating on water, because you've got full control if you've got a huge ship and engine. You've got no control if you're drifting in a raft, and obviously you're aiming for some middle road between those two, because
mm,
full control being too rigid, you end up with a situation like the Titanic, bang into an iceberg because you think you're fine, and that doesn't go well. So
mm,
an intelligent maneuvering is what you're looking for. But your point, I think, about governance being thought of as heavy control um, is a good one, and there are good reasons for it being like that, and that is that a number of times organizations, companies have got out of control completely. You've had major disasters and crises and really bad things happening, like the Bhopal disaster, for example. Union Carbide having a whole factory blowing up because they didn't care about putting safety into the place because there were no governance controls. And in a response, because it's a difficult thing to fix, people try to choose simple, magical solutions that don't work. And that's where things like Sarbanes-Oxley comes from. You know, if you give people a million check boxes to tick off and they tick off all of them, then you're going to be safe. But just putting
It
things
doesn't
in
work that way.
cages doesn't make you safe. It makes it more
Mm.
dangerous. It's that book Anti-Fragile made the point. You put things into tight cages, and all you end up is an explosive, fragile situation where instead of a gradual failure, you're going to get catastrophic failures. So
Yeah.
it's a stupid thing to do.
Yeah, and I think that the book that I referenced is the answer in the book basically was the more rigid you make your control environment, the less compliance you'll get. And I think that's very true. Yeah, I'm busy with some projects at the moment, including some large financial services organizations. And when I ask them, and even senior people, whether they've read the policy the policy book, document, whatever, all the policies, most of them says no.
Mm.
Um, it's normally only those things that they needed to approve or sign off on. Um, now, if that's management, just imagine what it's like for normal people on the ground. I mean,
Yeah, well, I mean, it's companies have gone rogue often, and IT departments particularly. They are not in any way being controlled by the board, and the whole organization is sort of shambling in different directions at the same time, which is heavily dangerous. And yes, if you talk to anyone, they treat governance controls as a joke. I remember when I was putting together a governance for an organization, working through all the policy to make sure they were easy for people to understand, they were flexible, they meant something real. The only thing that the head of that organization was keen on was it possible to print them all out and put them into binders on a shelf so someone could come and look at them and say, here are our policies. Actually reading
mm,
them, having them easy to access online, not really interested. Why?
yeah,
Why? If we've passed the tick box of having dirty great manuals on a shelf, we're there, which is a
mm,
complete and utter waste of space and time. They might as well get rid of the bookshelf. There's no point in the paper ones if nobody, as you say, have read them. It's completely pointless.
yeah. Just shelfware. Just say to the auditors, there they are. Yeah,
Yeah. It's like painting life belts on the side of your boat. Look, we've got life belts all around. Great. But when it comes to sink, they won't work. And it's worse than useless because you'll have people thinking that they're safe when in fact they are completely exposed to everything. And
yeah,
that's the worst of this kind of heavy policy stuff is that veneer, because auditors, if they're lazy auditors, will come along and say, oh, have you got a policy on X? Yeah, it's shelf two. When it pull it out, look at there it is. Does anyone know about it? Well, that's extra work. He has to go and talk to someone that way. Great, got a policy, tick the box, off you go. I mean, I remember one
yeah,
day when years ago when I was with an organization doing ISO 9000, that's all about documenting what you do. There's a little team of people putting together documentation. They didn't talk to anyone. They just wrote it all down, in a corner. Finally, it was all ready. The auditor came to give the ISO 9000 um, audit. So everybody was told, and this was from the senior manager of the organization, tomorrow, don't come into work in the morning. The only people we want on the floor are the people who wrote those documents. So if the auditors walked up to anyone, they'd find somebody who knew what they were all about, where they were, how they did. They didn't want anyone else in the building. So literally that day, everybody was out specifically to avoid being properly audited for ISO 9000. And they passed. They got a certificate, ISO 9000 qualified, and it was a complete lie. After the people had left, nobody was going to read any of that stuff. It was an entire exercise in futility and danger, making things dangerous.
mm,
Rather throw the policy all away completely and do something that you mean to do and everybody is in line with and get into trouble with an auditor than have that rubbish, pay for that people to make that rubbish, and then claim that you've got something.
Yeah.
So I'm not surprised when I hear companies falling apart and having major crises and their software being completely not properly backed up. I mean, the recent thing we were talking about with banks, where they're being criticized because their disk drives are not being disposed of properly and aren't even encrypted. So anyone picking up one of these drives in a skip somewhere has got access to any amount of information. And they probably have a policy document somewhere ticked off saying proper security obeyed, but it's not happening because it's not part of what people are doing and thinking. It's written on some shelf somewhere. So, yes, none of this is governance. All of this is an illusion of governance, thinking it's like project management with heavy people coming around occasionally to tell people what to do and then go away. And then it's a joke. Everyone laughs. Oh, well, how's the project going? Well, we always tell the project manager we're 70% there, but we know perfectly what, they're just so used to lying to auditors and project managers and governors because they see it, as you say, as simply foolish imposition of meaningless rules, regulations, and tick boxes. Nonsense.
Instead of,
You mean, okay, instead of what it should be,
yes.
what governance is having a governing body, a board of directors, senate of an organization, understanding what it is that they are supposed to be doing as an organization, where they're intending to go, what
Hmm.
ethical and moral views they have on that, and whether what they are going to be doing is helpful to anyone, whether it is going to make money for the organization, and whether it's sustainable in the future. And when they've understood that, and obviously it doesn't just happen once, they have to keep reviewing and understanding, but that's it. Once they've understood that, they then have to make sure everybody in the organization understands it. Putting it into tick boxes, putting it into manuals is a silly way of communicating. They need to talk to people, present to people, explain to people, work with marketing to communicate these ideas so everybody understands them and listen. So when people out there say, look, you said we've got to do X 50 times a day or something, we can't do it. This is silly. It's a pointless exercise. Listen to that, work
Mm.
out what you're really trying to do and make it work so that it works, so you don't end up with a lot of people lying to you about what they're doing, because that doesn't, firstly, it makes people congenitally unethical. If part of your job has to be to lie because you're being asked to do things that are ridiculous, you're going to get into the habit of lying. And if all of the people in your organization are in a habit of lying just to be able to get this governance stuff off their back, you have an organization that is fundamentally inoperable, flawed from the
Mm.
beginning, because you can't even get truth up and down, let alone agreement. So
Right.
it's got to be communicating what people genuinely believe so other people understand it and the whole organization is moving in the right direction.
Okay, so that means everything that we do on a day-to-day basis then must be aligned with this. Shall we call it a true north that's been
Direction.
set by
Yeah.
the, yeah, direction? Well, that's why we call it a board of directors, isn't it?
Yes,
Because
they're
they need
direct.
to point the way.
That's where
Yeah,
we're going. Yes.
yeah. So,
And it should be easy for everyone to understand it. The point is, if they say in some jargon, as you see in mission statements, our mission statement is to, and a whole lot of words strung together that mean nothing but sound as if they're impressive. You say to somebody, well, if we do this today, will that be moving in a direction? The only honest answer, I've got absolutely no idea whether it's energizing or empowering or any of these funny words in the mission statement. It doesn't help me understanding where we're going. So, I just make up my own mind. And sometimes I do that and sometimes I do that. It has to be clear and understandable in a way that can be a shared understanding of everybody. So if you walk into an organization and talk to the person at the front desk, or go into the IT department and talk to somebody who's writing code there, either of those people should be able to tell you quite quickly and easily in simple language what it's all about in that organization and what they both say will agree with each other. Very simple requirement. And that's why the way of making sure governance works is not having people tick boxes to say what they've done, but the governing body with the organization once a year writes a report about what it has been doing and how well it's been going. So last year we said we'd like to be doing things more sustainably. We know we're wasting a lot of energy. We know that we're not helping our local community because we are in a community and people complain about various things and we're not dealing with them. So over the next year, we're going to try and work more closely with our local community, and we're going to try and look at our energy. After the year, you say, those are the goals we set ourselves, and we did this and we did that, and this didn't work so well, that worked quite well. And on the whole, we think that we are moving in a more sustainable direction than we were a year before, in our opinion. That is a useful, meaningful report because it's describing in their minds, considering where they said they were going to be going, where they've got to. And if they've changed their minds mid-year, the report will say that. We found that our plan was going badly or the economy was going badly. We had to change direction. So we know that those sustainability goals haven't been met, but we did this instead. So somebody reading that has got a meaningful narrative with figures. Obviously, it's not all just made up, that people can understand what has been going on. So just like in Agile, if the requirements have been changing for something, you don't just pretend they're the same and just go and do something different for the moment. You change what you're trying to do, and it should be organic within the organization that everybody knows. This didn't work, chaps. We thought it was a great idea. Hasn't worked. Now we're doing this. So again, any day you go and walk into the thing like today, you know that the last couple of days in the UK, there's been a massive drop in the pound, huge crisis about interest rates going on. Ordinary people are worrying about whether they'll actually be able to afford to pay their mortgage next month and the month after, because the increases are massive, hundreds of pounds a month extra people will have to find, and they've already been struggling. Now, if an organization is not taking that into account when talking to people tomorrow, it's basically lost. It needs to understand this is what our people are worried about. How are we going to talk to them to address it? Forget what we're doing as an overall company just for today. We have to try and reassure people, let them know what we're going to do to help them, because an organization, an enterprise is a sustainable unit of people trying to do something. And if you
Yeah.
just say, we're just going for this month's profit, you're ignoring all of that, and you're behaving as if you're instead working with some kind of mechanical machine. And people and organizations are not mechanical machines. You have to understand them as human and communicate them as human and understand. I mean, there's a nice conference in the Netherlands at the beginning of this year that had the theme of flow. Understand it all is flow. And having rigid plans and rigid goals is meaningless. But being able to look back and say what your goals were, how they matured, and how you're able to use your ethical standards, your overall ideals of being sustainable, of being good to the community, of being able to do what your financial goals are, to expand your customer base, to deliver more satisfaction, whatever your things are. How have you done in terms of them, in your own opinion, describing where it went and how it went? That is a proper governance report, and it should be real, and there should be no meaningless nonsense to
Yeah.
conceal
I,
things.
I'm glad that you used the word ethics,
Mm.
because I think at the end of the day, a good, and Mohammed, I'm sort of commenting on the last bit of your question also. A good governance system is guided by a set of principles, which most probably is based on the ethical viewpoints of most people in the organization, but definitely leadership, um, and not prescriptive. But you agree with that, first of all, Peter?
Well, yeah, I mean, prescriptive, there has to be some prescription because you're going in a particular direction. And I'm seeing questions like, what happens if some people aren't interested in being part of that? Well, the answer is if somebody is not interested in coming in the direction you're going, they should go and work for somebody else. Basically, it's simple as that. It is prescriptive. If our ethical view is we do not take bribes from customers, it's not okay because it felt like a good idea for somebody to take a bribe. They take a bribe, they're off, that's it, and you've reported it to the police. There
Yeah,
definitely are prescriptions and ethical values that you support, but everybody must know them. You don't suddenly come to
yeah,
someone who's been getting bribes from people for years and suddenly say you're out of a job because we decided to have a new policy that said no bribery. I mean, it has to be a shared understanding. And if you're moving from a previous state to a new state, you bring people along. But ultimately, of course, people have to come with the organization.
yeah. So sorry, I need to qualify what I mean
Yeah,
by prescriptive. So clearly, you have to move within those boundaries. Um, but quite often, I see policies being defined that actually tells you to do stupid stuff that most probably was a good idea 10 years ago or 5 years ago during a crisis. And and that's one of the things that there's a add on to the goal. I don't know if it's a book or if it's just a talk. I only listened to the audio book from Eli Goldratt. It was called Beyond the Goal. Um, and I don't know if you can remember the process they use, the Poogie process that they use to actually remove bottlenecks. Um, so you put it you you slow the system down to accommodate the bottleneck. Then
mm,
you understand the bottleneck, um, and that slowing the system down is quite often by changing your process or your procedure or having
mm,
some kind of a control that you put in place. Um, then once it's slowed down, you can go and work on the problem. You can remove the problem. But what Goldratt quite rightly said is most people then regard that control as a given, and they don't go and remove the control again.
mm, mm, mm.
So now it prevents you from actually speeding up again and doing something
That's
else.
that's why people need to have some kind of picture of how this works. So I think that a good example are these motorways that have variable speed limits on them. And
Yeah,
the way it works is we know very well from mathematical calculations over years on motorways, if everybody is traveling at 80 miles an hour and you have a blockage, they're all going to squeeze into that and there's going to be a massive queue, a huge bottleneck.
mm,
If, on the other hand, you give them a signal to slow down to 50, they'll probably get there pretty much as fast because a few kilometers an hour here and there doesn't make a massive difference to things. But because everyone in the queue is slowing down, the blockage resolves itself more quickly. So you're not actually slowing anyone down. What you're doing is you're optimizing the flow, and people need to know it's the flow that's being optimized,
yeah,
and have the understanding that if you see a policy or a rule or something that is simply blocking the flow, you should flag it yourself, whoever you are. This is holding me up, and let people
mm,
know about it. Now,
yeah,
if what's holding you up is that you can't give bribes to people anymore, well, then that's an important thing because you shouldn't, as a worker at the front end who's supposed to be making things flow, and you can't get them flow because unless you give this man a bribe, he's not going to let you get through customer, you won't get the part there. Why should you make that decision? Rather, that decision has to go back to the organization and say, look, you said we can't take bribes. That's the ethical thing. I want to do the ethical thing. But if I want to go into that country and I don't pay a bribe to the man at the gate, I'm not going to get there. And then it is up to the board to say, well, okay, that means we can no longer trade with that company. We're going to have to say goodbye to that country, goodbye to our customers. We are going to withdraw our staff. Then we'll work with a country that is ethical because otherwise we are not behaving ethically and we are encouraging the corruption in that country. And part of the job of a company is to make the world a better place. If you end up collaborating with countries that encourage corruption, you are making the world a worse place for people in
yes,
that country and for your people. So you have a duty for someone not to just pay the bribe and say, well, of course I've got to do what you get the stuffs there, but for someone to realize, well, I'm being blocked from my job because of this. This needs to be escalated right back to the board, even if this is a lowly employee or even a contractor traveling somewhere. There should be a mechanism to make sure it's heard. That blockage
Mm.
is there, and it seems a conundrum, but when you think it through from the top level, it isn't one anymore. We can't work with corrupt organizations because it is corrupting to them, to the people working in them, and the citizens of the country. Corruption is something that has to be fought against because it's not sustainable. Corruption actually, as it says, it corrodes, it corrupts, it breaks down the proper order of human affairs. It makes things worse, it makes them bad. So as an organization wanting to make the world a better place, you simply have to have that as an iron rule. We do not act corruptly. It's not part of what we do. It's not ethical. And if people do insist on acting that way, they need to go and work somewhere else. It's just not, it has to
Yeah,
be very clear that that's the case. But one answer to a blockage can be we don't flow that way. And it should
yeah.
be in certain circumstances.
But in most instances, it's actually stop doing this stupid thing that you ask me to do.
Yes,
Um, because in so many instances, when I help customers now to write things like controls and policies and stuff like that, one of the things that I ask them to add into a policy is why did you put the policy in place?
yes, absolutely.
Um, and the reason for that is when somebody reviews the policy a year later, they can read that and say, "Oh, but this doesn't apply anymore, so therefore the policy shouldn't apply
Yes.
or the
So
control shouldn't
absolutely,
apply."
as you said, there should be a review date and ideally an expiry date. This policy will be reviewed within 4 months. If it has not been reviewed in 6 months, the policy no longer applies. It has expired.
I
That
like
would
the
be the
expiry
kind.
date idea
Hmm?
also. I like the
So
expiry date. It's
yeah,
a
it
good
makes sense
idea.
because if you actually can't be bothered to review it, it can't be important. Get rid of it,
Yes.
drop it, forget it. And that way, that's a good way of cutting down the crud because, as we know from laws, one of the great things about something like the French Revolution is they throw away all that crud and they start again from scratch. Otherwise, you have an accumulation of stuff that is ancient and out of date that just there. So you need some way. I mean, our brains, evolution has had to deal with this because if we remembered everything, our brains would run out of space by the time we were about 3 years old. So our brains have a special mechanism where every single night they spend 8 hours actively throwing away memories, forgetting stuff, getting rid of it, and only keeping the stuff they think will be useful. That's how we survive as creatures. An organization should be the same. If there's an accumulation of craft there that's not active, not being used, don't waste space and time having it. Don't have people having to go and look and read the stuff when it's pointless. Expire it, throw it away, get it out, work on stuff that is current and useful. This is
Mm.
all part of the sustainability. It is not sustainable to keep adding more policy to stuff, sticking it on, because it makes it more difficult for any human being to comprehend all of it. And it makes it more likely that it'll contradict each other and less likely it'll be followed. So you should always be trying to keep the overall size of the policy down to as small as possible,
Mm.
making sure that most people don't make decisions because Rule 16, subsection 5 says X, but because I know we are trying to do this and that moves us in the direction of this. It needs to be an understood thing. Once people, I mean, I say it to people with contracts. If you have a contract with another organization for some long term thing, if you have to keep going back to the contract when you have conversations with your customer, it basically means you should part ways. It's not working. The contract is just there as a backstop in case things go really badly wrong, that you could go back and you could, do something about it legally. But that means you basically failed. Normally, every day, the operation should go ahead with you both agreeing what you will do and doing it in the interests of both parties. And yeah, there's a contract. And sometimes you might say, well, we're doing this extra work now and it's not what we imagined originally. Can you just pay us a bit extra for that? Yeah, fine. And you can adjust it. and the contract should allow for that kind of adjustment. It should not be fixed and rigid, and nor should policy be like that. And that's
Mm.
why, in a way, people who object to governance because they say it is bureaucratic are absolutely right. If it is bureaucratic and meaningless and bad policy, it is not good governance, it is wrong, and it should be thrown out. And if you have a company that spends its whole life concentrating on that sort of rubbish, rather go and work somewhere else. It's not a good place to be.
Yeah. So, but that brings us to the next question. There's a ton of people that selling governance systems
Mhm.
where you can go and load a bunch of rules and then tick them to be able to give a board report. And similarly, I mean, that's what auditors generally do also.
Yep.
Because let's face it, yeah, normally it's the partner that does the selling job, and it's a bunch of children that's doing the physical audit. I mean, with no insight of the business of the business. So, what's your response to that? Number one, and number two is how do you fix that?
Well, the reason for that is very straightforward and makes complete sense, that companies are still working on a system that was brilliant when it was first invented, something like 200 years ago, which is a general ledger. It was a brilliant innovation. The idea of being able to divide things into different departments and put so much money there, so much money there, helped them understand what was going on in small organizations. It should have been superseded at least 100 years ago, but unfortunately, it was being run by accountants. And so it stayed there. And there's still companies who wear everything on the general ledger. And it is rigid, it is badly defined. As you know, even now today, you will find general ledgers in which there'll be an entry for Y2K that's got money in it, that people are doing something with. It is a meaningless way of managing things that quickly goes out of control. And managing things as services, the metaphor of services, having a service portfolio in which what you are doing in a particular area as a service is documented and understood, and the money going in and the money going out is understood per service, makes so much more sense, because you can then understand the dynamics of the flow of money as you understand the dynamics of the flow of work and the dynamics of the flow of virtue, where people are doing particular things well, where things are not flowing so well, and so on. All of these different flows come together when you manage them as a portfolio, because instead of dividing things into a department, which is, old clerk system, when they didn't have proper communication, it made sense. People worked in a little department, communicated not much with other people, because it was a telephone was the best they could do, or a letter. Now you can communicate instantly with thousands of people at the same time. You don't need this primitivism. You need to have people understanding this is what we're trying to do with the service. This is the flow of that is creating the value. This is the flow of money as it goes through it. And as you were saying earlier, these are the blockages. These are the things that are not working. What can we do about it? And also, is it fitting in with our overall ideals of being sustainable? Should we be doing this service? Are we doing it in a way that keeps our customers and our employees and the people next to the factory happy? Is it delivering value to the community, humanity as a whole? And if it's not, then how do we either stop doing that, or how do we find a service that can do that in a way that is sustainable? Doing it at a service by service level, as a service portfolio that the board then understands, is a way to get rid of this general ledger rubbish. It's a way of actually linking the finance, what you're doing in finance, to what's going on in the organization. And I think that as long as you keep things linked to a general ledger, you've got a disconnect, because you see profits and losses by department instead of seeing them by activity and flow. And that's just not the way it works in reality. So it is inevitably a skewed view. And the other thing is, if you do manage things by a service portfolio, when a new person joins, and it might be a new director on the board, or it might be a new employee, you can show them the portfolio. These are the things we're doing. This is what this is about. That's how this works. This is how this helps our community. That's how this helps our employees. It's all graphic, easy to understand, and you can understand the flow. because I spoke to one chap who was a director of a very large company, and he said it took him at least 2 years to even understand what the company did, because there was this huge mass general ledger stuff about departments, and he'd occasionally go on a visit somewhere and find there's part of the organization doing something, and eventually after lots of visits he managed to pick a picture in his head about what it was. So for 2 years it was basically completely useless, helping to make decisions where he had no idea what the implications were. Utterly bad governance. It should be a simple to understand dynamic model. And if it's not simple to understand, it should be split up so you can understand the different parts. And, the standard stuff of allowing human beings to grasp things. If it's not graspable by everybody, it's too complicated, it's badly put together. And that's what the general ledger is about. I mean, it's archaic. It's a primitivism.
But if you say that, then the way that we allocate resources and budget also should change.
Yes, of course.
Uh,
Yes,
because you shouldn't finance a department, then you should finance a service or
exactly
a
right.
product.
Yes, exactly right.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
That,
And the service may need.
that's going to create a lot of pushback, eh?
No, of course. I mean,
I agree with your perspective, by the way. That's why I've been able to make that statement. But
but this is about actually governing as opposed to pretending to govern. And if you sit there with a dirty great spreadsheet that only the finance director claims to have a basic fundamental understanding of, and he's probably not telling the truth anyway, um, you are on the deck of a ship without you know what do they call them, a wheel to
compass.
through it, without a compass, without being able to see out of the windows, and basically listening for the sound of the ship banging into things. And as long as you can't hear it banging into something, we're doing fine. That's no way to run an organization. It's not governing one. So people who are genuinely wondering why is it that we screw up all the time, it's useful to paint them a picture of what they're doing. They're in this blocked off control module, getting virtually no information back. Most of the information they get back is either difficult to understand or actually wrong. And they're giving various instructions that people are ignoring because they're too complicated, difficult to understand, and are basically unconnected with reality. And you're then surprised that this thing goes aground. I mean, of course it's going to go aground. What you have to do is clean the windows, get rid of this rubbish, and work out how to actually make it work as a going organization. Again, I'm mentioning a ship, but another reason that these old organizations fail so spectacularly is having hierarchical organization. So people give a command to someone who gives it to people below them, gives it to people below them, and they haven't got proper flex of information up and down. So something that seems like a reasonable thing, well, why don't we just head north at the top, is completely unreasonable at the bottom, where they can see a big shoal of sand sitting in front of them to the north. We need to go around it, and by the time it's got down there, it's too late. You hit the thing. So there needs to be a genuine engagement with the board. And obviously, senior management, CEOs and CIOs and so on, are involved in working out the detail and helping with the communication and all of that. But the board needs to be on top of it and really understand it properly and have a working, viable model. And if somebody doesn't understand something at the board level, expect it is not going to work. And when
Yeah.
rubber hits the road.
And here's another interesting thing for me. Whenever something goes wrong, it seems like the natural tendency in hierarchical organizations is to get somebody higher up to make the decision, who
Yeah.
knows less about it and most probably will make the wrong decision.
Yes. And the Peter Principle says you're guaranteed that the people in the highest positions are all at their level of incompetence. They were good at their last job and they've been promoted too far and they're not good at what they're doing now. So you're running blind, and you've got a whole lot of people around them who are actually coming to work every day feeling nervous that they're going to be found out because they know they can't really do their job. They've been promoted too far or too quickly, and they don't know what's going on. And so you have a whole lot of frustrated, unhappy people. And this is not looking after your stakeholders, because your managers and your employees are all stakeholders who should be getting value and enjoying things. And if they're coming to work every day worried that they're going to be found out because they're basically in a job they can't handle, you're not doing them any favors. You're not
Mm,
treating them as proper people. You are, and there are lots of sort of dead end jobs where you end up with a group of say 5 middle managers. 4 of them have no idea what's going on, and so the other 2 are basically carrying them. This is what we do now. This is what we do there, and that again is just. I mean, people help one another. That's how we survive. However big the mess, people say, well, let's work out the way through this. And all of these, most companies you come across are surviving through the complete mess that's been made by the goodwill and common sense of the people doing the job. And you need to harness that and get rid of all that other rubbish and connect it properly to the board so that there is a harmony,
mm,
between what is wanted in terms of flow and what you're getting in terms of flow. And okay, a service portfolio may not be the only answer. It's the most obvious answer I know, and it's the one I think that works. Somebody may come up with a much better solution. But the problem is having a system 200 years old, and it's like a religion. Accountants that change properly are trained to understand this rubbish, to be able to read spreadsheets. Reading a spreadsheet is supposed to be a skill. A spreadsheet is supposed to be communicating. It shouldn't be a skill to read it. It should be obvious to tell you because it's there to help you. Having something where people have to be trained in order to read it tells you you failed. It's useless. Get rid of it. Replace it with something else. As I say, I think a service portfolio is the answer because
mm.
I think if you design that properly, you can get it very easy to understood by people needing it for different reasons. It's quite easy to structure these days, and it's really good for marketing, communicating, focusing on things, and measuring and understanding flow, including and particularly the flow of money, which is important. As you say, you pay things, services for what they need to do, not groups of people for a particular task, but for the overall fitting in with the service. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's radical, but not in the sense of extreme. It's radical in the sense of getting down to the root of the issue. And the root of the issue is that, as I say, that the general ledger was an absolutely brilliant invention
yeah.
200 years ago.
So
And it's crazy we're still using it.
yeah, so uh, I think it's a little bit beyond the ledger. I think we can relatively safely say it's general accounting practice
Yes.
that needs to be updated. Um, but
Updated in terms of services, yes. And I agree, you can still call it the general ledger. The name doesn't really matter, but it needs to be not focused on units of people and hierarchical structures and rigid designations, but focused on services and flow and activity and how to be able to understand, measure, and react quickly enough in order to support the things that need supporting. So, yeah, there are a set of requirements that this needs to
yeah,
follow. And the current counting methods don't comply with those
yes,
requirements.
and I think that's one of the challenges that most organizations who started adopting lean had was that there was just a disconnect between
Mm. And
what
you need
lean
to
was
make it,
trying to do
yeah,
and what the accountants were trying to do, and that's why there's a set of accounting practices for lean
yeah.
where you measure value and uh, value creation and and outcomes.
And what did they do with those practices? When they've done all that measuring, where does it all go? Back into the general ledger, yes, to fit in with all the other stuff.
Yes,
So,
but the ledger now looks differently. The ledger now doesn't look like a bunch of departments, but the ledger now says, here's a product. This is the value that it creates. Therefore, customers are willing to pay us this amount of money, and it costs us so much to provide that service. So
no,
now
there's
all of a sudden
definitely
you've got
moving
a
in the right
true
direction. I
view
agree.
of what the organization is doing, because there's a huge disconnect between our expenditure on one hand, um, and I think it's even worse in IT because IT supports the business that actually creates the value. IT doesn't create the value themselves.
Mm, mm.
Um, and that thing, I suppose, leads to people doing risky things out of desperacy. So
Mm,
let's
mm.
talk. Let's talk little bit about IT going rogue.
Yes, well, I mean, it's a natural thing to happen. You know
Mm,
that if the board and it's obviously it's getting better as time goes on. There are fewer people who are completely naive about the digital economy and computing and digital devices. You know, these days, okay, they may not be able to type particularly well, but you would expect most directors to have a cell phone and have some idea of how to use it. 20 years ago, that wasn't necessarily an assumption you could make. So yeah, it is getting better. They're understanding it, but they're still not understanding some of the issues and concerns that are involved because they haven't been exposed at school, for example, to coding. So they don't understand that writing a program and building a bridge are different activities, and you can't expect the one to behave like the other. They need you need to be able to grok that, not just say that these strange people cause trouble in development, but rather understand that that's a difficult, more intractable issue they're working with. So the bridge analogy breaks down. But if the board doesn't understand that, IT is then left in getting some instructions and policy and guidelines too detailed in some places by people who don't understand it, and not detailed enough in other places. So IT, seeing this lot, decides, well, we don't know how to use these, so we'll make up our own. And that's when it's gone rogue. And they may say, well, everything seems to be a mess around here. Let's go and get the ISO IT governance standard and use that and see if things get better. Well, you can understand the impulse, but if they're doing it, it's rogue IT. They're missing the point that it should be the whole organization working together. It doesn't actually matter if IT was able to somehow govern itself so well it did a brilliant job, it would still be useless because it's only a brilliant job if it's integrated with what the whole organization is doing. If you've got a separate group that are all hyper organized, well, that's brilliant. That's nice for them, but it doesn't help the whole organization to be integrated. So they should not be, they should be refusing to try and govern themselves. They should say, this is not our job. We need to work with the board so the board understands what our issues are and allows us to develop sustainable policies in line with what we're all trying to do.
yeah.
And so often IT is an enemy of itself by trying to organize when it's got no instructions, it's got no guidance, it's got no direction, and it thinks, I can't cope with this uncertainty, I'll just make up my own stuff. And the moment they're making up their own stuff, they're moving off in the wrong direction. Even if it looks like a good direction, unless they are working closely with the board, it is the wrong direction. It is rogue. So all of these local fiefdoms where you have very organized and bureaucratic and probably even very good people and so on, managing IT departments that are very different in their efficiency from the rest of the organization, should be taken apart and integrated. So the efficiency can be transferred to the rest of the organization that needs it, and the wrong direction can be removed from them. Because
Mm,
this is one of the frustrating things of it, that you end up as an almost natural thing, as we've spoken about in different contexts before, with IT spending a lot of time and money supporting lousy software and lousy services because they're the ones that need all the help. But they are not necessarily the ones that are creating all the value. They shouldn't be supporting them. They should be saying, can we get rid of this rubbish now, please? We don't want to support it. We want to spend our time supporting things that are actually helping us in our overall direction. And they should be going back to the board saying, you know that we're all sold on this. We've been using this system for the last 20 years. It is actually rubbish and holding us back, and we're pouring money into it. It's invisible to you because we keep pretending that we're doing something new and special and exciting. But in fact, we're spending all of our time to keep this rubbish together. Get rid of it.
yeah.
Start on a new slate and work it
And
out properly.
yeah, and we talked about IT now, but it can be any fiefdom in the organization.
Yes, yes, of
Yeah.
course.
Um, and I think one of the biggest problems that and it's also self-created, is we started talking about IT governance, which doesn't exist. There's
That's
no
right.
such thing as IT governance. There's only organizational governance. Um, And if you don't want to believe me, I will read the cover of or the subtitle, "A Business Framework for the Governance and Management of Enterprise IT." That's the subtitle of COVID. It's not a IT governance framework; it's a business framework
Yes,
that you use to govern IT. So who governs IT? The business.
exactly.
Um, who manages IT? Well, obviously IT managers, but the direction comes from the business. Yeah. So
Absolutely. And as we're seeing now, the discussion is moving further. Do we really need IT managers or do we need managers? Because saying that you explicitly, and many years ago, you needed to have managers and directors in charge of the electricity supplies because that was a new haywire technology
or
that needed
statistics for
management.
that matter.
Sorry?
Or statistics. Can you remember organization having statistical departments?
Yes, yes, yes.
Guys who ran around with slide rules working out stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and the trouble is that once it becomes a habit, oh, lots of other organizations have an IT department, we must have one, and of course we must have IT managers and so on. Everybody just does it because everybody's doing it, but that's not good governance either. Governance should be looking at every part of the organization radically down to the roots. What's
Mm.
really going on? Is this really giving us value? And having a whole lot of people who are experts in doing all sorts of technological things isn't necessarily as useful as having people who understand your business well, who you are teaching in order to interface and work with technology things. Spreading the technology across the organization so everybody can help with it is probably better than having a little team of magicians looking after the magical IT department. It's been slowly moving away from having the monolithic mainframe in its special room being tended by the priests. It's better than that, but it still has, that model hasn't gone away. There is still an element of that in IT, and it needs to become more like the electricity supply. So, yeah, you have some techies who will come in and fix something. And yes, if you do want to understand how to work out the calculations for a major substation, you do need an expert. You can't expect people to do that stuff on their own. But most of the time, people can deal with plugs and plugging things in and changing fuses, and they can work with the stuff. And that's where we should be moving to, so that the experts are kind of brought in to deal with unusual, big exceptions rather than being thought of as being a priesthood that has to be kept there to, you know,
Mm.
keep the technology
Okay.
beast happy.
Let me take things back a step. So, understanding the value streams in the organization that we use to create value for customers then becomes an essential activity, but also a capability
Yes, yes.
of management and of the governing body.
Yes, and of individual people in the organization, of everybody. Everybody understands what they are, how they're working, where they're going, and can use the same language. This is a blockage. This is holding me up. Or this flow of value is really good, and I can see that there's an increase of flow, and people are wanting it. We need to have more, and that, like Toyota or something, where all the people on the factory floor understand it. Yes, that does have to be definitely a capability of the organization all the way through. I agree.
Okay. So, what do we then do with, I don't know, do you know the work of Michael Gerber? He unfortunately passed away last year.
Mhm.
I think he was a social anthropologist. But he wrote a book that I quite enjoyed. It was called Bullshit Jobs.
Yes, yes,
Um,
yes. I know.
um,
I was referring to that earlier on when I started talking about these useless jobs. Yes, you're quite right. Yeah.
yeah. So, what do we do with these monoliths that's now been made part of every organization that says we've got a QA department, a audit department, a governance department. And yes, I know I'm going to most probably, I can maybe even include architecture there. Um, tick off a bunch of people, let me be frank, piss them off when I make statements like that. Because it's in these structures that we often see things being developed that's not
Mm.
in line with the reality of operating. Well, I can mostly speak from an IT environment. I think IT people do a lot of things in spite of
Yes,
quality control, security, and
exactly,
architecture.
precisely. Yes,
You
because they're
agree
not
with that?
properly Oh, absolutely, they're not properly integrated. That's what I'm saying. People will say, "Oh, yeah, we know that's the policy, but obviously we do this."
Doesn't
And
work that way.
it's a standard way. As I say, this is having your employees lying to you all the time. Yes, of course we follow. Of course we do. Of course we do. But the moment your back's turned,
Mm.
of course they're doing it another way because they know that that's bullshit. It doesn't work, and they also know there's no point in telling senior managers that bullshit. They'll just get upset. So the whole thing stays like that, which again is why you need this proper, honest flow and communication through the whole organization. And yeah, the steps of getting there are difficult. And the political issues you have when you've got a nice, powerful fiefdom built up of trying to uh, modernize, improve, move that into another world are indeed very difficult. Very, very, because they're good at survival. I mean, that's the one thing
Mm.
that these bureaucratic monoliths are best at. They'll survive anything. I mean, you know
Yeah,
that thing about administratium, don't you?
yeah. Um, yeah, that makes me think of Terry Pratchett, yes,
Yes,
uh, and the Unseen University.
yes. He understood these things very well. Yes. But they're real. I mean, they're all funny in his thing, but they are really real. And if you want to go and do battle with them, well, a lot of people
Yeah.
have decided reasonably that life is too short. We'll just leave them there. Um, but really, if you're wanting to have a sustainable organization, that is the wrong approach. You need to
Mm.
get some people who are prepared to go out doing dragon slaying and replacing and all that stuff. You do need to get rid of these monoliths eventually.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, they do go, when a company folds completely, they have to go off and build an empire somewhere else. So there are times when these empires do collapse. The thing is, the trick is to try and get rid of them before the company crashes so that you can survive. But yeah, I mean, obviously, the head of the board of directors is going to look at that lot and the accountant sitting on the board and think, am I going to pick a fight with that lot, or am I going to try and get an improvement in products? And given the choice, I'll spend time with the product because they'll whinge less, and it'll be, and sadly, that's not good governance. Good governance is where
Terrible
they are
governance.
prepared to bite the bullet and say, what are the real issues
Mm.
here? And if the real issue is the finance director, work on that issue. It may not
Yeah.
be nice, but it's essential if you want to have good governance and you want to be sustainable. If the finance director is a block to the future and the finance organization is nihilistic, you need to get that out.
Okay, so we coming up to an hour.
Mm,
Um, can you believe it? How quickly it's gone past.
they do, yeah.
Now, I normally end off by asking my guest a question, but let's make it short today. I'm going to ask you to give a new um, chairman of the board 3 tips on making governance working well within an organization.
Hmm. See, that's a good one. Um, well, the first is to understand it, understand
Yes.
governance as a thing, and understand what we've just been talking about,
Yes.
to understand the whole
Okay.
picture. And there are training courses that can help with that, and books and so on. The next is to work with the board to understand whether it is possible to get uh, um, an agreed view of the important directions, because one of the directions is, how do we get rid of the rubbish? And if they don't agree there's any rubbish, you can't get started. So the next is to get the board on board.
Okay.
And that might mean some directors have to move. If they say, look, the company's been like that for 40 years and that's the way we like it, then they're probably not good people to have on the board anymore. So that's quite a big challenge too. Get the board so everybody on the board understand what you're trying to do. And then the third one is to communicate, because once you've all understood what you want to do, the really crucial thing is to communicate with everybody, including your customers, your employees, your suppliers, and the people living next door about what you're trying to do. And I think the big secret behind getting this to work, and somebody gave me this a little while ago, and I was talking about ADA, and I was saying, why don't any organizations use ADA? It is the only known way to have reliable and secure computing. Why don't banks use it? Why do they use, closed source rubbish to go and do serious stuff? It's mad. And this person pointed out, he said, well, actually, quite a lot of the top banks are using ADA, but they're not telling anyone because they see it as their unique, special, niche advantage. So they keep it secret and they use this. Now, if your director can convince the board that this thing about good governance and governing through a portfolio of services is a secret weapon that can be kept secret, for a start, you can be sure they'll leak it very quickly. And then they can start seeing it as a benefit that is radical instead of, oh, we've got to change our governance, which just sounds
Yeah.
like, getting a new project manager. So it needs to be exciting. It needs to have everybody involved. It needs to be radical in the proper sense of radical. And once you've got the board agreed, on side, working with it, then you have to communicate to get it to work.
Awesome. Peter, as usual, it's been fun.
Yes, it has.
Um,
Thanks. Sorry, I've been
and
talking an awful lot, but it has been
yeah,
fun.
no, this is absolutely awesome. I mean, I think our conversation is going to be used in conversations with a number of customers. Um,
Well, I hope so. I hope
yeah,
people find
so
it useful.
I'll just give them the link and say, go and listen to this conversation. Because you know
Well, I
what they
really
say.
do hope it'll work. I think it's really important stuff, and I think it's exciting, and I think it can be fun doing it and really productive. But it does require quite a leap. I
Yeah,
agree.
it does. It does. Yeah, it's not. Yeah, it's a difficult conversation to have, but something meaningful and important to do. So
Well, it helps
once again,
knowing, having a picture of the vision. And I think
yes,
that's what we've been talking about, is a vision. We know we can't get to what we're talking about in 5 minutes in most organizations, and it would be wrong to do it that way anyway. But as an image, as a picture of where you'd want to be, I think that's what we've been talking about. And if
yeah,
people can share that view, then definitely it's achievable.
awesome. So if you wanted to um, get in contact with Peter, um, so for some reason it's showing my
Oh, there we
bar
have it.
also. There we go. So I just don't have a telephone number for you, but I think three ways of getting hold of you is enough. Um,
Yes.
and your LinkedIn profile, I can't remember what that was.
Oh, I can't either. Peter Brooks.
Okay, there are quite a few Peter Brooks out there,
What's that?
including a Sir. Um,
Uh,
and then just a reminder before I say goodbye that the Out Innovator competition book is available now. It's leading from the high level prescriptive one way of doing transformation, um, and you can buy it on, I don't know, somewhere. There's some links. Yeah, on top. It is not available at Amazon because Amazon is full of nonsense. It's available at all the other good bookshops. Thank you for listening. And Peter, if you can just stay online for a moment,
yes.
I'm going to say about goodbye to our audience. Um, and thanks for listening.